Hey there, let's talk about 8K RAW on the Canon R5C. It's a headline spec that a lot of people like to talk about, and I think in practice, very few people actually use, including myself. I don't have any immediate need for shooting 8K RAW. It is something that's unique to this camera that you don't find in a lot of other cameras, especially at this price point and size. So I think it's really powerful, but I think, as I said, a lot of people aren't really using it. Now, there is a use case for some people out there. I'm not going to discredit that. There are some situations where people are using that, but most people are delivering in 4K or even 1080, and so I think it has limited use. But what I want to do in this video is I want to talk about sort of the image quality that comes out of it, obviously. I also want to talk about the usability, how it actually works in practice, and whether or not you should be shooting in 8K and some of the reasons that you might want to consider doing that. So let's get into the image quality first, because I'm sure that's what you're probably most interested in. So for these tests, I shot in 8K RAW ST, the standard mode, 8K RAW LT, the light mode, and I also shot in 4K XFAVC 422 10-bit long op, because that's the mode that I shoot in most often. And this is all shot in 24 frames a second, and you're looking at a 4K timeline. So keep in mind that the 4K in this camera is oversampled from that 8K image. So take a look at the comparisons here, and then we'll talk about them. There are definitely a few takeaways from this image quality comparison test. First of all, the two RAW modes, the ST and the LT, to me personally looked very, very similar. So if you're going to shoot in 8K RAW, I'd probably just shoot in the LT. It's a lot less data. I also didn't see a huge difference between the 8K and the 4K because, as I mentioned before the image quality test, the 4K is oversampled from 8K, so it retains a lot of that detail and sharpness that you get out of the 8K image. So it's really up to you. I think when you are exporting the video to YouTube in 4K, I don't think there really is much of a difference, as you probably just saw. Now, one thing I noticed when working with these files was that they were slightly different once I brought them into the computer. Now, of course, the 4K XFAVC is shot in C-Log3 and the 8K RAW is in 12-bit RAW. And so when I brought them in, they had slightly different curves. And what I noticed right out of the bat, just looking at the images before I even color graded them, was that the 8K RAW images, both the ST and the LT, had a lot less contrast and were much flatter. So I had to work them a little bit differently because I was grading them by hand. I also noticed the colors were slightly different. So even after I adjusted the exposure and contrast, I noticed that the colors were slightly different between the two. I don't know what the situation is with that. Maybe something to do with the way it compresses it. I'm not really sure. So those are the things I noticed between them. But overall, I think in terms of real world application, I really didn't see a big difference in dynamic range or detail and sharpness because of that oversampling. Now, one thing that people like to use 8K for, there's several, but one of the main reasons I've heard about people using 8K is the ability to take the image and then reframe. So you can punch in, move it around and not lose any detail and still export the image in 4K as long as you don't push in too far. So let's take a look here. And what I did was I looked at the 8K versus the 4K and then zoomed in a few times, and let me know what you think. I didn't really notice too much of a difference at 200%, but once I zoomed in at 400%, that's where the extra resolution of the 8K RAW definitely made a difference. Remember, as I keep saying, the 4K is oversampled from 8K, so it retains a lot of that detail. One thing I did notice, as I mentioned before, is that color shift becomes a little bit more apparent as I push into 400%, but I'm not really sure, again, where that comes from, but you can tweak things around just a little bit more to make things match. But overall, I think if you are taking the image out of this camera in 4K and exporting it in 4K and uploading it to places like YouTube, I don't think there's gonna be a ton of difference in image quality between 8K and 4K. Now, I wanna talk about usability in two different ways. First of all, we'll talk about it in the camera and how it works, and then also how it plays back and edits on the computer. In terms of the way the camera works, it works flawlessly. It works the same as you're shooting in 4K, so no issues there. Autofocus works great, all that kind of stuff. But one thing I want to point out, which was kind of weird, was that when you go back to look at the files on the computer, I just want to show you this. So when you press the media button to look at your files, you can see here all the files that I shot, and you can go and play them. But what's really weird is that you can't access RAW files and non-RAW files at the same time. So you can see at the top of the screen, it shows RAW index. So the only way I could figure out how to do this, maybe there's another way and you know, let me know down below, is to go back and change this from RAW over to the XFAVC, and then press the media button, and now I can access the non-RAW files, the XFAVC files. And one thing I do want to point out, and this is not unique to RAW or XFAVC, is that when you play the files, there's no LUT applied. So even if you have the LUT that's, you can see on the screen, the display LUT, it doesn't actually play back when you're playing the files, which is really frustrating to me when I'm out shooting because I'm not getting a good sense of what the image looks like. But I did want to point out that when you are going back to play them, they're going to be kind of in different sections, and to find them, you have to go into different sections in the recording menu and then go back and look at the files if you want to look at them while you're out shooting in the camera. Now we'll get on to talking about the usability of the footage in the computer, how hard or easy it is to edit with these files. And I did have to make one small tweak in my editing software, but before I talk about that, I just want to let you know what I'm working with here. So I have an M1 Max Studio that I do all my editing with. Here are the specs of my computer, and I edit in Final Cut Pro. Now I did have to make one tweak because once I dropped these files, the 8K RAW files, into my timeline, it was hiccuping quite a bit, and so it wouldn't play back smoothly. All I had to do was change the setting from better quality to better performance, which is under the View drop-down menu. And once I did that, it played back completely fine, even multiple layers of it, no problem. So what I would do was leave it in that setting, do all my cutting, and then when I went to color grade it, I would just change it back to better quality, and then I could see the image a little bit better when I was color grading. Overall, it was a pretty straightforward approach. I personally am not a fan of proxy workflows. I will pay more to have a faster computer or use a different camera because for me personally, I'm doing a lot of high turnover content for YouTube and client work. And so for me, I just want to make sure that I can plug the files in and get going with it. And so for that regard, like, it worked pretty well with my computer. Again, I have a decent editing computer, but that was my experience. Next, let's get on to talking about the elephant in the room. Of course, the file sizes. They are absolutely massive. But anytime that you're working with either like a 6K or 8K RAW workflow, no matter what camera system you're gonna be working on, they're gonna be massive files. And you need to be aware of that and ready for that. Not just in terms of the memory that you have for your camera, but also storage and having a drive that's fast enough and big enough to be able to edit the whole project at once. So there's a lot of stuff to think about. Now, when you look at these data rates online, they're listed as megabits per second, which, remember, there's 8 bits in a byte, so you need to divide by 8 to get megabytes per second. So I want to go through all these different modes just so you get an idea of it, and to bring it into perspective as well, I'll talk about how much you can get on one card. I've been using this 512 gigabyte card from Angelbird. The price is incredible. I'll leave this link down below if you're looking for a very inexpensive card that you can shoot all these modes on. And I'll tell you how much you can get on each of these based on what the camera tells me. So 8K RAW ST is 1,580 megabits per second, which turns to be 197.5 megabytes per second. I don't really think about megabytes per second, but when you convert that over, it's 11.85 gigabytes per minute. That's a lot of data. And for one of these cards, you'll get 42 minutes on 512 gigs. Now, when you compare that to the 8K RAW LT, 1030 megabits per second, 128.75 megabytes per second, you get 7.725 gigabytes per minute. So 7.725 compared to the 11.85 in the ST, I highly recommend if you're gonna shoot 8K, shoot in 8K RAW LT. And to put this in perspective for what I usually shoot in, which is the 4K XFAVC 422 10-bit long up, which has a data rate of 160 megabits per second or 20 megabytes per second, which is only 1.2 gigabytes per minute, you can get 425 minutes on one of these cards. That's 10 times the footage you can get in 8K RAW ST. So I really want to drive the point home that it's not just having a couple extra Angelbird cards or CF Express cards laying around. That you have to think about the entire workflow and storage because it adds up quickly. If any of you have been shooting video for any bit of time, you know that the storage adds up and becomes an extra cost that you have to think about. So really keep that in mind. In terms of overall usability, I think it works really well. The camera handles it really well. The footage is awesome. But why would you want to be shooting in 8K like I sort of talked about at the beginning of this? I think the big one is the ability to punch in or be able to move or pan around the image. I think that's a great option. If you're doing extreme color grading, like if you're handing this footage off to a colorist or you're extremely talented and you want to push the camera pretty far, remember it's 12-bit versus 10-bit, so there's more color information in there. For me personally, I didn't see much of a difference with my sort of workflow in getting onto YouTube with the images that I shot. So I'm going to be using 4K XF AVC, 14 to 10-bit long op, like I mentioned, for most projects. But I wanted to put this video out there because I hear a lot of people looking at specs and talking about, oh, an extra half a stop of dynamic range or 12-bit versus 10-bit. And in reality, working in 8K RAW on this camera is very challenging for the reasons I already mentioned. So I just want to put that out there. Again, there are some use cases for it if you're delivering 8K or if you are needing the ability to do either punching in, panning around, or extreme color grading. Of course, 8K is going to be awesome, but keep in mind the data rate. Anyways, wanted to share this with everybody because it is a really cool feature in this camera, and Canon's really pushing the envelope with these high resolution and frame rates and all that kind of stuff. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please consider hitting the subscribe button down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.